Hey folks, Steve here with a post-mortem video for the Deadly Woods. If you're not familiar with my post-mortem videos that I do when I cover a game, these are really intended to just be my thoughts in the aftermath of the campaign that I played through on camera, and to kind of help organize my thoughts in terms of how I think I did as each side and things that sort of have come to me as I've played the game and sort of understanding the rights and the wrongs of the strategies I pursued and everything else. So, um, yeah, this is not a review. We'll do a review in the short term soon. Um, and not to spoil that video, but I come I'm going to be coming at this with a pretty positive viewpoint of the game. Um, so a couple of things first off the bat, right? If you haven't watched the series and you want to watch it, and or need to watch the finale and you didn't watch the final episode, and you want to know who wins, I'm going to spoil that right now. So if you need to go back and watch anything else, if you don't want to be spoiled, if you care, go watch the other videos. If you're cool and you just want to keep, you just want to hear what my thoughts are, then keep on watching. So the Germans won, right? The Germans managed to hold on to Saint-Vith, Houffalize, and Bastogne, and so they had one more victory city, or victory hex, rather, um, than they even needed. We did withdraw the SS units, which meant that we only needed to hold on to two. That was sort of the trade. I could imagine a situation where maybe, depending on where your victory points are at and where you've sent the SS units, you would not want to make that decision. You would instead keep them, but then you have to hold on to three victory hexes for sure, right? And I was thinking, well, this might, I assumed I would lose one of these, and thus withdrawing those units would allow me to have a little bit more flexibility. And I ended up not needing it, but I think that was still probably a good move for my game position. Some of that was because all of my SS units were like up here, and I had enough units nearby that, yeah, sure, I could pull them out and I could kind of make something work here to keep them around, or keep things in pretty good shape. And that was true. So as the Germans, I mean, I think I certainly played fairly well from that angle. Now, I think we were pretty close to achieving a automatic victory at various points in the game. This mostly due to Luxembourg being really close to being taken, and we did have Neufchâteau for a while. That would have been enough. If we had held on everything else, that would have been enough. We were even threatening Eupen or Eupen, however that's pronounced. Uh, we were kind of opening the door for that, though it just didn't work out. We didn't push fast enough or hard enough. So I think at various points of the game, the Germans were really close to winning. And I think because in the early game, they pushed into Bastogne, they pushed the Americans out, and the Americans just had a hard time fighting in this area afterwards, really helped contribute to the Axis victory. I think if they had been gummed up outside of Bastogne, or the Allies had control of Bastogne, and you had sort of like a historical uh, situation going on where the Allies occupied it but were surrounded or whatever, I could see that being a greater issue for the Germans. That was also why I tried really hard to make sure that we could take it outright and didn't have to deal with that situation. Um, so I guess by the difference was that focus on Bastogne, and maybe that's a little bit of like hindsight, like becoming hyper focused on Bastogne because it's so famous for this battle and this campaign. Um, I never really tried to go too far out here, right? I didn't. At only in the late phases of the game did the Germans ever have units that were out of supply, and that was after the Americans had sort of done some counterattacks. I did a really good job of avoiding putting my guys too far out ahead. I didn't really try to get out past the Meuse, or I wasn't willing to unless I had a lot more um, a lot more support, I guess, to help those units. But I don't know. I think the incentive is there in the game, right? You can win an automatic victory by getting 9 mechanized steps across the muse. That's just 3 units, really. But I'm not sure how easy that actually is to perform. And I'm not even sure if they need to be in supply or not. I should look at that while we're talking here. Okay, yeah, they have to be supplied. So it's like, okay, if I'm really trying to look at this realistically, I'm going to fight with the camera here for a second. Let's say we pushed way outside our safety zone. We got way out here and we managed to get over the muse, or tried to. We would need to get 3 full strength armor units across the muse, and they would have to have a clear path of supply at the end of the turn. I suspect that's really difficult to achieve. Now, I'm looking forward to other people doing videos and showing the different ways the game can pan out. And in fact, I'll put a link in the description below to a guy whose channel is called, I think it's Cataclysm Now. He's got a couple hundred subscribers. Seems to do a good job doing playthrough videos in this sort of style, similar to mine, but obviously his own, his own thing. He's also playing through this, so if you need a point of comparison, and I would advise that you do if you're interested in the game and you just want to see more and you want to compare experiences, check out his videos as well. I'll put a link again in the chat, not the chat, the description down below. You guys can get that. Check out his stuff. He's also posting those videos to Board Game Geek, so you shouldn't have too hard of a time of finding those videos if you want to see them. It's just interesting to compare people's game experiences because he's playing solitaire. We have different minds, so he may have focused differently on different parts of the map, or his chits came out differently, so what order of operations could impact the flow of the game a lot, I suspect. So it'll be interesting to see how people compare. But I would want to see an example of, like, what's it look like that someone tries to get over here? How'd they do it? What was the order of the chits? Because I feel like the order of the chits probably matters a lot for that. Because ultimately, and maybe you do it with Piper on turn 2 when they've got the fuel dump marker, and somehow you've raced all the way out here. But I still have to suspect that's incredibly difficult to do. I think Piper starts somewhere back here, so let's just assume you have like a super clear path out this way. It's still something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in one move, and then depending on what path you take, maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, you could get maybe up to Liege or something like that in a couple moves if you had completely clear terrain and nothing in your way. I think that's unlikely. Not just unlikely because the Americans are going to have units on the board somewhere anyway, but they get reinforcements and all of that, and it just becomes, I think, really difficult to imagine a game situation where you could reliably get across here for an automatic victory. It's there. I just don't know. I suspect it's just very difficult to achieve. Obviously, it didn't even really historically happen, so that makes sense. I think historically the Germans were like out to here, but I don't think they quite crossed the Meuse. I'm pretty sure they didn't. I have to check my history on that. So, getting close is one thing. Actually achieving it is another. If that's an automatic victory with enough units, okay. But I think the supply is going to be the issue because there's just so many road paths. And because the Allies have motorized movement, if they start on a road, no matter what kind of unit it is, if they start on a road, they can use motorized movement. I think it just makes it difficult for the Germans to achieve that. And maybe you don't even try for that, and then maybe you're just playing ahistorically from the get-go because of that, right? If you're never really trying to cross the Meuse, you might not be really trying to achieve the historical the historical intent. Yeah. So I don't know. From that perspective, it's like, yeah, is there enough incentive to try to push all the way out here? I don't know. I did play to what the game tells me to play for, which is objective markers or objective hexes ultimately. So my intent to, I think Sanvith you have to get. I think you have to try to get that. You want to get that as early as possible. I think Hufalese is important. You try to get that. You try to get Bastogne, right? Those are the three core areas that you need, and yeah, they form a bit of a bulge shape here, right? I think Luxembourg is certainly possible if you got down here fast enough. You could entertain taking Luxembourg, but I made that almost impossible to take as the Allies. Neuchâtel, obviously, if you got Bastogne, that's sort of the next obvious one. It's actually not hard to get to Marche from this area if you clear the bridges, but of course that is going to be the problem. If the Allies blow the bridges, you got issues. Um, and then even just trying to get through here, I think it just gets really congested. The actual woods and forest terrain makes it a little harder to work your way through, especially with your armor. They can only move slowly through these woods, the deadly woods, as it were. Har har har. But it you have a little easier opportunity of movement down here. It seems like, and so that obviously is a good place to focus. Um, so yeah, I mean, as the Germans, I think if you're just playing like, hey, I want to get objectives, I want to hold objectives, I want to corral my forces, I think you do well here with that. And maybe that's simply allowing you to be a little ahistorical. You could play more conservatively than how it really hashed out, and the restrictions around the army zones and everything else. I mean, that kind of keeps you reined in to a certain degree in what you can achieve. Um, and there's just not as much of a driver, I think, like having played it out, less of a driver to get to the Muse. I just, if the opportunity's there, then yeah, you go for it. But I think very quickly in your game, you're going to know, is it even worth trying, or should I just do what I did in this game, which is fight to have a good control of the general space if you can achieve it, and then be on the defense. Now, if I were to switch my brain over to the Allied side, I can tell you that I definitely didn't play as optimally as I should have been able to. Um, I guess that's a lesson learned on my part. I ended up having too many units tied up down here. That wasn't good. I should have swapped some units out or something to make sure that my higher combat factor armor got to be more of a force against Bastogne rather than the edges or down the side. So those patent chits were useful at first. They kind of waned in usefulness. Ended up using the Monty side of that particular specialty chit to focus over here, and even that wasn't enough. Uh, I think if I had just, I think I was in a hurry a lot of the time because I have so little gaming time. It's like I want to get in here. I want to figure out what I'm going to do. I'm going to go play it, and then I got to stop and I got to go and I got to do other stuff. If I just slowed down a little bit and worked out the combat factors and figured out more efficient ways to have a hex with the right number of combat factors to get better odds, I think there was like the one combat in here where I was off a column shift by one combat point. I missed it by one. Now I know that can be annoying for some people. They don't like dealing with trying to find the perfect combination of combat factors. Here, I mean, it's like trying to understand like these are my best top performing awesome troops, and I need to put them in the critical combat. And I failed to do that. I mismanaged. I did not orient the best troops for the job in the right places at the right time, and that's on me for failing to do that. I think I did what I could, because some of this is a function of movement. I couldn't move that unit into the right place at the right time. I had to put in what I could. But maybe if I just thought through things a little bit better, I would have had better odds and maybe better odds earlier, and that would have shifted things. The other piece of the puzzle, I guess, is as the Allies, you really do like those retreat results, and you can get retreat results on even a 1-2. So it could be, if the situation's right, I mean, go for a 1-2 combat or a 1-1 combat, because you still have a 33% chance of getting a retreat, which would be enough to put the Germans in a tough situation. Um, we couldn't quite achieve it in the final turns where it really mattered. I should not have left it to the final turns to matter, I guess, in terms of my playability. But um, it was certainly an element. Like I don't think the Allies were destined to lose this game the whole game. I think they certainly had the capability to have won. The luck of the die roll meant that they didn't. But I think that should have also been mitigated by more astute play, and I failed to do that. I will say that the Germans racked up quite a eliminated pool for the Americans by just very diligently attacking, putting American units out of supply, attacking them, reducing them, pushing them back, and not letting up. Not being too lackadaisical. We stayed aggressive as the Germans throughout most of the game, and that meant that even as the Allies got reinforcements added, rather than having a huge stockpile of units, I mean, we still sort of ended up with that at the end game. But even through the mid part of the game, or the early the early part of the second half of the game, the Allies didn't have this huge preponderance of force, um, as good as they might have, because the Germans were aggressive, because the Germans ensured that they could push the Allies around a little bit and weaken them, so that the Allies were more reliant on replacements and trying to get units back in position. I ended up never using replacements to rebuild units. There were always units on the board that it made more sense to replenish rather than rebuild. But other games obviously could vary, or you might decide to do differently. I think it really comes down to, for the Allies, how are you setting up your attacks? How's your stacking looking? Are you doing really efficient stacking? And I think in several places, and I probably wouldn't be able to find the perfect examples all the way through, like I might have had two divisions split across two hexes with another division, and that's really not efficient because the stacking rule is basically like a division plus one extra unit. The best way to stack is to have, let's say, a division is 2 to 4 units, depending on what we're talking about, division we're talking about. You should have 3 to 4 units of that division all in the hex, plus an extra one, like one of these airborne units maybe, or some other unit that doesn't have as an important of a divisional role but has high combat factor. You can get a higher per hex attack value by doing that. And I think I was so desperate to move around and get factors that I missed the forest for the trees. There's another woods metaphor for you. I missed the forest for the trees, and uh, I probably could have dealt with this traffic jam a little bit more by ensuring that divisions were operating more cohesively rather than spread out and possibly in many places overlapping with other divisions of the same corps, or maybe not even the same corps. There is an advantage in mixing corps a little bit because that means that you can use more artillery markers like we did here, or a higher likelihood of using 8 artillery strength points rather than just 4, right? If you're only attacking with third corps units, then you're only going to get to use third corps. But if there's an eighth corps in there, all of a sudden now you can use eighth corps artillery as well. You can use 2. So there's some, I don't know, balance or art or some good way to probably play really effectively. Really smart allied player is probably threading the needle on keeping divisions together, not just because of the divisional integrity penalties if they're not close together, but because they can stack better, more efficiently together. Um, but doing a little tiny bit of mixing and matching to get optimal artillery attacks, right? I think there's some mix in there, and you might need to change your stack setups depending on what you want to do to maximize your ability to punch into places. Because if you just need a retreat, the higher odds you go, from 3-1 to 4-1 to 5-1 to 6-1, it continues to increase your likelihood of getting a retreat. And ultimately, a retreat was more important than any other die result, um, because it meant the enemy had to vacate the hex. BL1s, they're useful for weakening the Germans, but you really don't want BL1s, if you need to take the victory hexes back. You need to move those guys. So and of course the combat chart is relatively linear, where the better odds you get, the fewer BL1s and the more results. So I think even the force ratio and the linearity of the CRT still reinforces you having higher and higher combat odds in order to have the better combat result, right? Um, but you could fall into that trap, and maybe I did a little bit, thinking, well, a BL1 is fine. A BL1 is fine. We're going to continue to weaken the Germans, and then they can't defend anything anymore. There's still an element of truth to that, but when it comes down to the wire, and again, thinking, if you're on the last 3 to 4 turns of the game, that's still, you can count them on two hands or less, maybe even on one hand, how many combats you're actually going to get that are going to be worthwhile. If you're only got to, if you're leaving the game to a handful of die rolls, you better be operating as best you can to figure out how you're going to crack that nut wherever it is, whatever area you're dealing with, whether it's Bastogne or anywhere else on the board. Um, it was interesting to see the Monty chit take over, priority from the Patton chit. Patton, his side was really important to bring these third corps units up and to kind of drive north, and that the historical element of the conflict, obviously. But then, of course, the Monty chit really helped us over here when we needed to take, we lost, but at least it was helpful, trying to bust this area up, because we wanted to get these British into the fray and have them perform well. We already had the 7th Corps around here doing stuff. So there's almost, and I suspect this will apply in other games too, maybe a natural progression where Patton is really useful at first, and then you need to put some Monty sided shit activations later in the game just to help press somewhere, right? Any which way you use that shit, you're either pushing probably from here downward or from here upward. This kind of seems to be how that shit is going to end up being used, unless you really change up where you're putting your 7th Corps and British units. For me, it seemed natural to get them to this area from where they entered and where they needed to be, to support the attacks. What else to say here? Yeah, I mean, I don't think the game is balanced one way or the other. I can't tell that from this playthrough. Again, I definitely feel like I should have done a better job as the Allies. Absolutely, I should have taken more time to think through what they can do in any given activation, and I should have done a better job navigating the terrain. Sometimes it just creeps up on you, like, this forest is so inconvenient if you have motorized units, because they can't get through this dense forest right here. So if you're trying to rearrange your troops, you've got this big forest, that's a huge problem. And it usually doesn't become a problem until all of a sudden you need to do something, right? You don't think about it. Like, this forest here isn't a problem until it is, right? You don't even really think about it until all of a sudden, oh no, I can't do a quick shuffling of units to get the right combat factors that I want, because the forest is too dense. So terrain is really important. The fact that motorized Zocs don't project into these woods or forests for that matter, but especially even these woods, they can traverse that terrain very slowly, but you don't have Zocs through it, which means you definitely, I mean, there is a whole element to putting the right units in the right areas for the right job. And I think I should have done a better job of that as the Allies. For the Germans, it didn't matter as much because I was sort of on this offensive, and by the time the Allies were in force, we had taken what we needed. And in those early parts of the game, the map is thinner. So the Germans have a lot more options to get to where they want to go in terms of, the hex to hex movement. Which way do you want to take it? They have a little bit more leeway. There's not as many allies just up in your face like the end game here is. But in the end game, there's only so many places for the allies to go. And again, I should have done a better job. Maybe that means that the difficulty of the game, at least for me, is just naturally for the allies because they kind of have a different thing to achieve. And it feels like they have a harder time achieving that depending on how well the Germans do in the early phase. I guess if the Germans really screw up the early game, then maybe that makes it easier in the late game for the Allies. Where I did pretty darn good, I think, as the Germans early, and the Allies had to dig themselves out of that a little bit because the Germans had done so well and had avoided taking step losses, had avoided getting hurt too badly, and that just ended up impacting the whole game, which should happen in a campaign game, right? Every turn should matter, and I think every turn did matter in this game. Um, so yeah, the only other thing I guess I'll say, this goes for every Dark Series game. Things like assets, whether we're talking artillery, technically artillery and air power are abstracted into the artillery chits together in this game. But this goes for the Dark Sands and the Dark Valley, where assets for sure help the defender. You can use assets to give you just enough for a better odd shift, but those assets are always better on defense because they have a higher chance of impacting that ratio, because you're talking about the denominator. Much easier to shift down against the attacker when assets are applied to the defender. And so, for the Germans, it's a very easy decision, right? As long as you're attacking, go ahead and use your artillery and have that help out attacks. And as soon as you think you have to be on the defense, you're really only using your artillery for defense. Now, the rocket artillery, and I might have screwed this up a couple times in the early game, but it didn't really matter too much. These can really only be used for attack, not for defense. So the Germans always have some resource that they can't use for anything but attacking. The Allies, because they have their special artillery capability, I mean, obviously they're using artillery for anything and everything. But in this game in particular, even those handful of artillery chits that the Germans still have ended up being very powerful and very useful. So I do think that artillery asset usage is an important element of the game to just think about, like, maybe if you make this kind of attack, you don't need to bother putting in artillery. That saves it for a different combat. All of that efficiency and action is an element here. The fact that there are road junctions, I mean, Bastogne obviously important. Neuchâtel is important. Even some of these other ones out here, La Roche, Marche, Verbomont, any of these places that are junctions for roads really, really are important. Super important, because if all of a sudden you can't get down a road, or let's say you kind of control, all these hexes right here, just as an example, but you don't control Libremont, you don't control the town that is the junction, well, the units out here have to trace supply back to here before they're in supply. That's tricky. And then you really can't do motorized movement through here because the roads don't link, right? And I realize this is like standard no dust Steve stuff, but the game does, does make them important, as they should. So the game, has it right for that purpose. Fighting for those important junctions of the roads, that really governs where you can choose to go next. So those are obviously important places to focus on. That can really slow things down. If you can hold on to a road junction, you could delay the opponent by quite a bit, depending on if you're attacking or defending or whatever. So all of that felt pretty good. Yeah, and overall, I mean, the bridge repair stuff obviously got to the point, the Germans repaired what bridges they could if they had to. It ended up becoming less of an issue later in the game, and then once they were on the defensive, the Germans had blown a few bridges in a couple of places. It seemed like they had less opportunities to really worry about that, where the Allies can repair them much easier, and they just, in general, didn't really care. And of course, when they're on the offensive, they don't need to blow up bridges anymore. They want to keep the bridges intact if they're fighting over territory, because ultimately, they wanted to get across this river here. They're not going to destroy this river, right? They're going to get over it. Or I'm sorry, destroy the river, destroy the bridge. They're not going to destroy the bridge because they want to get over the river. So they're doing that, obviously, and they can pretty easily, as long as they're paying the movement penalty over the destroyed bridge, repair that, without too much fuss. But that is an interesting element of the game that matters a lot. It matters if you can get that, blown bridge from a retreat, then that's really valuable, right? If you can succeed in defending a bridge and you can blow it, that's really powerful, because whatever then the German or the ally has to do to repair it, there is that penalty, there is that extra sort of thing they need to deal with. For the Germans, they have the hard limit on how many bridges can be repaired in a given turn, and that can slow things down as well. We had that go on over here, where it was like I had to pick which bridge in the early part of my offensive, which bridge was it going to be that I was going to operate through. And I ended up picking this one. It might have been more efficient to pick this one, honestly, but that's how it goes. But we had cleared it enough that we could use this road. Because of this, we could operate basically until we could fix other bridges, and that worked out too. So there's always some element of managing your bridges. Which bridge are you going to pick? Is it the right one? Is it the most efficient bridge you have? Or where do you not have a choice and it just has to be your bridge to get across the river? And the fact that rivers impede supply tracing unless there's a intact bridge over it means that the Allies really could not afford to cross a bridge unless they knew for sure they were going to have supply on the opposite side of it for the most part. Whereas the Germans, because they checked supply based on the chit, could entertain the idea of getting across rivers in an unsupplied state if it helped them, take a bridge down river or upriver or whatever a little more easily. But again, my conservative play when I'm playing solitaire against myself with chit pull just meant they really didn't outrun their supply limits as much as they maybe could have. But yeah, all that put together, it made for an interesting gameplay experience for sure. It really, I suspect, if you weren't accounting for my explanations and videos like this where I'm explaining what I'm doing, I suspect it would be somewhere around maybe 12 hours. Let's see what the box says, if they have anything on here where they make playing time 6 to 12 hours. I think that's about on the nose. If you're only playing the 6-turn scenario, then that would probably be 6 hours. This was 12 hours, about an hour per turn. Truth be told, by the time I was at like turn 6 or 7, I felt like I really had the game system well burned into my brain, and I kind of knew how to operate enough that turns like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 went by really fast, much faster than other turns. There's also fewer chits. So the reality would probably, I would suspect that you spend more time on turns 1 through 6 than you will spend time on turns 7 through 12, just because 7 through 12, again, fewer chits. What needs to be done is clear. Rather, like in the early turns, the Germans are just figuring out where they want to go. Where can they go? What are the opportunities? What is the game presenting us? You got to decide. You're figuring it out. But by the time you're in the late phases of the game, the Allies know what they need to do. They need to deprive the Germans of victory hexes. They know which ones the Germans have. They can focus on those. They can try to take them back. And so your decisions about the chits, what to do first, and what to do when other chits come up from the cup, usually are following a very logical decision-making process. So yeah, late phase of the game probably plays a lot faster than the first phase of the 2 phases. But yeah, somewhere around 12 hours sounds about right. You could probably get it done faster once you've played it once or twice. You and your opponent have played it, once or twice, and you're just moving a lot faster. You know how to play. You're going to burn through it a lot more quickly. You could probably get it done in a long, gaming session in a day, which is convenient because there's uh, a lot of other bulge games that I think take longer than that. So there's certainly an element, like there is for the Dark Sands. Not so much for the Dark Valley. That's a big game, but the Dark Sands in this game are short enough that it is a little easier to try to get this played. This is definitely shorter than the Dark Sands. Dark Sands is 17 turns, I think, um, and probably around that long to play, 17 hours ish, maybe something like that. So definitely shorter playing, not a huge amount of footprint for the actual components and everything. Like I laid out all the sheets because I had the room to do it. But if I had a smaller table, I could probably still make it work pretty reasonably. So that was good. I never felt pressed for space, or I never had a hard time finding a chit or a counter or something that I needed to find. I sometimes had to dig through my piles of third step units, but and I didn't organize them very coherently. So when I knew I needed to get it, I just look through each stack quick and try to find the individual unit that I needed, and it usually wasn't very hard. I'd find it pretty quick, right? You're just sorting through one stack, you grab it. Whoops, you grab it a little bit more elegantly than I just did right here, and you just you're looking at the edge of the counter. You're looking for the division, and then is it A, B, whatever unit it might have been. So that was really that was a pretty simple thing. And my only difficulty or annoyance was having to figure out or having to remind myself which of the American and British units were locked. And of course, we made that mistake early in the game where I had used I think it was the 10th Division, Armor Division, when I shouldn't have been able to. But we were able to fix that. So that's one thing that was kind of tough, having to remember that and make sure that I saw which units were those. And I think there could be something put on the counters that would make that a little bit easier. I'm hesitant to use a pen or something on my own counters, but I may need to mark them somehow so that I just remember they're locked. Maybe I draw a little lock on them or something. I don't know. But that would have helped a little bit more in the fact that there's already something in the game where certain units can't leave a distance from entry hex J up here. They have an asterisk next to the movement marker. I would have liked that on some of the other units that get locked, just so there's something to remind you there's something special there to deal with. But okay, guys, this video is probably longer than I really wanted it to be, but it is a post-mortem, my thoughts just on how the game played and the different game elements. And I think it all came together pretty well. It was an interesting game experience. So this will filter into my review to come. I'll do that in my usual format. Obviously, for you guys who've been watching all these videos, you kind of probably have a good sense of what I think of the game, but we'll package that all up into one video for all the other folks who can't stand to watch, multiple hours of a playthrough series. That's a tough time commitment, I know. So yeah, we'll look forward to the review here. Hopefully, sometime in the next week, we'll get that out. And I've got some other fun games that I would really like to play, and you guys might want to watch me play them. So we'll figure that out as well. So thanks for watching, guys. Really appreciate it. Hit like if you like the video. If you're watching this and you want to watch more of this kind of stuff, then you should hit subscribe. I've got all sorts of videos covering several different games, including mini games from this series. So worth checking out. Take care, guys. Keep gaming.